Oh, thank you very much. So this colloquium, with its focus on CATENA, has been presented in conjunction with European Research Council COMPOL, I'm 5 years out of date already, CATENA project, which we have been running in Birmingham for the last 5 years. So to set the scene for the other papers, as principal investigator, I'm going to open by giving you a brief overview of the project and what it has achieved. If I can get on to the next slide. If I can... Oh, I am. Well, that's not much good. Ah, stop share. Oh, yes, that might be good now if I share screen and connect to that one. Is that better?
Yes.
Can I get on to the next slide? I can. So the inspiration for CATENA came from that earlier ERC project at Birmingham. And obviously, if I was giving this paper on Wednesday, you'd have forgotten everything I told you 2 minutes ago. The focus of COMPOL was on the earliest commentaries on Paul as sources for the biblical text, which meant that we dealt primarily with Latin material, there being a lot of Latin commentaries on Paul from the 4th century. But one of our doctoral researchers, Dora Panella, wrote her thesis on the Greek CATENA tradition of Galatians, while David Parker, who was the consultant for the project, drew up a new list of Greek New Testament CATENA manuscripts, which included almost 100 documents, which did not feature in the Kurzgefasste Liste, in the official register. So that preliminary work indicated that the topic of CATENA was worth pursuing in greater depth. And about the same time that that project came to an end, we were in contact with Cambridge University Library following their acquisition of Codex Acinthius, the oldest New Testament CATENA manuscript, after a major public fundraising campaign. So a new edition of Codex Acinthius, using multispectral imaging techniques, was originally the first work package in the CATENA project proposal. But we were fortunate to receive funding for an even more comprehensive approach to that manuscript, including an edition of the 12th century lectionary overtext from the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council, while CATENA was still being evaluated. So what that meant was that the two projects ran alongside each other for 18 months. And I mention that in particular because the work on Codex Acinthius has gone on to play a significant role in some of the subsequent research of the CATENA project, leading to new insights which wouldn't have been possible without the preliminary work on that edition. And following the award of European Union funding under the Horizon 2020 programme, the CATENA project began here in Birmingham in June 2018, that distant era which we now call pre-pandemic, and means that we might view this phrase Horizon 2020 in a slightly greater light. We didn't know what was on the horizon at that point. But our work plan, like most of my work plans, seemed to have 3 objectives. The first was to produce a new catalogue of CATENA manuscripts, building on David Parker's initial list, in order to produce the first ever complete directory of these documents. The second objective, with a rather portentous title, was to examine whether there are distinct groups among CATENA manuscripts and how these different types related to each other. And then the third element was to investigate the importance of CATENA for the text of the New Testament in conjunction with the development of the Editio Critica Major. And that entailed not just using the published volumes in the ECM, but also making hundreds of new transcriptions of the Pauline epistles in order to examine the biblical text across the whole of the New Testament. And one other thing we put in the proposal was that we would use phylogenetic algorithms to analyze that data and compare it with the result of the coherence-based genealogical method. So that was what we set ourselves up to do. And 5 years later, thanks to the people you see here today, except Jacopo, I don't know what's happened to your picture. It definitely had it when I originally put this together. But I think we have achieved all of those objectives and far more, because such is the generosity of the ERC funding that in addition to paying for your lunch today, the project engaged 6 postdoctoral researchers, 3 doctoral students, and a team of 18 student manuscript transcribers, as well as administrative staff. And as a European funded project, and indeed, as we're all gathered here today, I'm pleased to celebrate that diversity of nationalities. Our core group brought together people from 4 different European countries and the USA to work together for a sustained period of time. Only 3 of that team of 18 students were from the UK, and graduates of our project have gone on already to accept academic positions in 3 other European countries. So given that Horizon 2020 not only saw the coronavirus pandemic, but the distressing spectacle of Brexit, the way in which a research programme such as this has enhanced capabilities of people from diverse countries and will continue to provide both formal and informal connections for European collaboration, continues to demonstrate the value of such international funding programmes and how they benefit both this country and participants overseas. There we go. I know you know that, but we have to say it. It's really important. And I'm really pleased that we have had such a broad team working as part of this project. So let me return to the project and its outcomes. Life-size picture of Georgi to welcome us at this point. So our first objective, to make a catalogue of all Greek New Testament CATENA manuscripts, so that for the first time we can say exactly how large the corpus is. And I was really delighted that Georgi took on this task with his unparalleled expertise and industry. Defining a CATENA is not always straightforward. I suspect by the end of this colloquium we won't be much closer to working out exactly what a CATENA may be, but the maximalist approach we have in this catalogue stands us in good stead. There are around 400 CATENA manuscripts which Georgi identified, featuring varying numbers of exegetical scholia, supplemented by an appendix of 260 witnesses to compilation commentaries by single authors, such as Theophylact, which are often treated as CATENAe in editions of the Greek New Testament. And the production of a new catalogue led to a significant number of new discoveries, as we anticipated. So in total, the project identified 35 new Greek New Testament manuscripts, which have been added to the official register. Georgi also recognized that 5 pairs of witnesses were parts of the same original document, but which had been assigned different numbers, and also located a new fragment of a known manuscript. And then subsequent investigations have led to the identification of one 16th century manuscript as a copy of a printed edition. And at the last count, but it is going up, 4 manuscripts which were copied from other surviving documents. So even this slide alone, I think, is quite a contribution to our understanding of the New Testament tradition. But the discoveries haven't ended there. In the catalogue, Georgi went above and beyond in not simply listing CATENA manuscripts, but also identifying the types of CATENA within them on the basis of the first and last scholia. And that led to the isolation of no fewer than 23 previously unknown types of CATENA. Many are only transmitted in a single manuscript, but others are attested by small groups of witnesses. And several of the CATENAe, which were listed in the Clavisclavion Graecorum as codices singly, only appearing in one manuscript, now form part of a group. We have other witnesses to the same CATENA. And in some cases, those groups have more members than what we thought, according to the CPG, were more major CATENA types. But fortunately, as with many things these days, the CPG no longer exists in printed form. During the second year of our project, Vepols released the Clavisclavion, an open access online database comprising multiple claves, which now really is the first port of call for all information about scholarship on patristic writings. All of the online New Testament CATENA entries have been revised with details of the findings from this project. So here you open up C145, and you can see that Parpolov identifies 9 manuscripts of this CATENA, and there's the CATENA catalogue listed there as a reference for that. And in cases where the CATENAe with even fewer manuscripts, those are listed by shelf mark individually underneath. So this database is enhanced with the work from this project, and the more time we have, the more information we can add as part of that. The project too has released its own open access database based on the catalogue, and that allows the data to be ordered by siglum, by library, contents, format, and so on, along with more complex searches. And unlike the printed book, it's been possible to update this with new entries or links of additional sets of images, adjustments to CATENA types following the search as we've gone on. So do refer to the CATENA catalogue in conjunction with the printed catalogue in terms of identifying the latest information about these CATENA from the project. Because having that data, completing the first objective, has then enabled the other project members to produce that comprehensive investigation of the entire surviving tradition of CATENA as is now known. So, fingers crossed. Jacopo, he does look like that. I don't know why, it's the same picture on the other side, so I don't know why that vanished. But Jacopo was able to examine all of the witnesses of the Pseudoecuminum CATENA on Lomans before selecting 8, which he transcribed in full. Not only does his doctoral thesis, which is now being prepared for publication, confirm that the Pseudoecuminum type seems to be the earliest CATENA tradition on Paul, but this online material provides, for the first time in most cases, the text of over 1,300 scholia, which make up this compilation. Jacopo also considered the way in which these scholia relate to the direct tradition of the patristic authors, but of course many of them preserve exegetical material from the early church, which has not otherwise survived. So there's a whole richness of material there to look into regarding Romans. Emanuele Scieri, it's your turn for your picture to vanish, which is such a shame, but there we go. If that's the worst that happens to the PowerPoint, I shan't be disappointed. Could stand up and we can all take a look and see. So Emanuele has worked on the CATENA and Acts, and again provided the first full account of CATENA and Acts. In his article published last year in Vigiliae Christianae, he has shown that the processes of expansion, but actually more frequently, I think, abbreviation, have led to a much more complex set of manuscript relationships than was suggested in the Clavis Papam Graecorum. And Emanuele has developed a revised classification for these witnesses, which is now adopted and integrated in Clavisclavion. One of these findings has been that although the Andreas CATENA is often seen as the principal CATENA on Acts, actually the best attested is the one attributed to Ecumenius. And I wonder whether that reflects on the position in Revelation as well, that we have many more witnesses to the Ecumenian CATENA on Acts than the Andreas CATENA. Right, will this picture display? Yes. Andrew Patton is our third doctoral student on the project, and he has been applying the new catalogue data to understand the history of Gospel CATENA. And his prize-winning article in Novum Testamentum showed that the reason that some New Testament manuscripts have the so-called Western order of the Gospels is because that was the sequence in which the accompanying CATENA was produced. And he has further established that there are 2 basic forms of CATENA on the Gospels, which are often found in combination. And so accordingly, he has revised the classification of the principal CATENA on Luke in the CPG, and that will be sent to Clavisclavium later this year. But Andy's research also puts him in a position to reconstruct an early CATENA, an early compilation, which, a bit like the CATENA found in Codex Acinthius, represents a distinctive stage in the early history of the genre. So there's more to come on that. And finally, I mentioned the work of Panayotis Manafis, because building on his work on Byzantine historical compilations and his contribution to the Codex Acinthius project, Panayotis has continued to research the least well-attested CATENA on Luke. And shortly, coming up, he will say more about how this has enabled him to identify new witnesses to the CATENA of Codex Acinthius, which fill in pages missing from that palimpsest. And he has a full text edition of the Codices Singuli with scholia on Luke, which will be published by De Gruyter later this year. So all in all, the second objective of the project has been addressed even more comprehensively than originally planned. We now know much more about the different types of New Testament CATENA and the way in which they relate. What we have, it seems, is not an open book tradition with copyists adding scholia as they please. Rather, as the different types in the CPG indicate, there are distinctive editorial stages in the tradition of these compilations, even though these are sometimes obscured by the challenges of copying these very extensive commentaries and also the use to which individual documents have been put. So I hope that in that way, the project has established something of a paradigm for further research in the field. We know there are these CATENA types. We know that manuscripts can generally be associated with them. And the creation of editions of those types and having full text editions of the Scholia remains to be done for multiple New Testament books. So it's exciting that there are already multiple projects underway, some of which I hope we'll hear about at the colloquium, which we're beginning to build on these findings. It's one of those moments where my computer wants to update. It only ever chooses to update in the middle of a presentation, doesn't it? So the third objective was to consider the importance of CATENAe for the text of the New Testament. Obviously, some individual witnesses, notably Codex Akintius, have a very important biblical text. But I wanted to know whether there's more we can say about the tradition as a whole. So the published volumes of the Editio Critica Maior, along with the online interfaces to the CBGM which accompany them, offer a way of exploring this, highlighting different CATENA types in the textual flow diagrams of the Acts of the Apostles, or the Catholic epistles with the CATENAe all in colours, or the Gospel according to Mark, give a sense of where the witnesses appear in the overall tradition of the biblical text. In some cases, manuscripts with the same CATENA type, so a big group of Theophylact there, or a particular CATENA here, clearly do form part of a distinctive tradition with regard to their biblical text. But in other cases, we have witnesses distributed across a wide distance within the textual flow diagram as it appears. And comparing those groups with readings in the edition enabled me to build up a typology of variants, which, although they're not exclusive to CATENA manuscripts, are often predominantly attested in these witnesses. And they include things like long omissions, changes in connectives, other variants in introductory material, or occasional lexical differences. And the conclusion to which I came was that just as users of an edition are better able to assess the significance of particular types of variant reading by knowing that they're found in lection lists, the same is true of CATENAe. If you can see at a glance, and you can here because I've coloured them in for you, that a particular reading is only or predominantly found in manuscripts with CATENAe, that I think provides pertinent information for the assessment of that variation unit. You're not going to think that that might be the Ausgang's text, either of those two, because you can see that almost entirely it features in CATENAe. And this is a typical sort of introductory phrase, which is liable to be adjusted following the exegetical scholium beforehand. So one outcome of the project, which I was pleased to talk about at SBL as well last year, has been to add a new feature to some of the forthcoming ECM volumes. Witnesses which are CATENAe will be indicated by a superscript K after their siglum. That's not a change to the Gregory-Aland system, because, I mean, for the start, not all CATENA manuscripts have a commentary on every biblical book, so we couldn't call them K on 1943. If you want to know which biblical book the manuscripts had commentaries on, you'll need to go and look at the CATENA catalogue online anyhow. But this is a qualifier which draws attention to the documentary context, which could have some bearing on the nature of the text. And in the case of the Pauline epistles, I think this is going to be particularly valuable because up to 1 in 3 of the manuscripts selected for the ECM of Paul are CATENAe. So if you see our initial apparatus of Galatians here, we have large groups of readings where the variant is only attested in CATENA manuscripts. And I think that's really helpful for you as users to be aware of. And so you see it in this initial apparatus of Galatians, which we produced as part of the CATENA projects, using the transcriptions whose creation was overseen by Amy and the electronic tools developed by Kat Smith. And the final stage of the project will deliver an initial apparatus of Romans on the same principles. I think we have until this time next year for that. And then, as originally planned, the phylogenetic algorithm was applied to that collation by my colleague Ed Edmondson. And that not only served to confirm the initial assessment of the biblical text of CATENA manuscripts using the CBGM, but also was instrumental in bringing to light some of the Abschriften which the project has identified. So those are the practical achievements of the project. And I think I still have time for a short reflection on some of the wider questions about CATENAe in the biblical text, which we might be thinking about in the next 3 days. The first is on the nature of their relationship. Is the commentary the paratext, or are the scriptural passages secondary to the exegesis? There seems to be no single answer, but in many cases, a strong case can be made for the latter, and there'll be a detailed consideration of that in the next edition of the TC Journal, which features a selection of papers from a workshop which Andy and Clark convened here in Birmingham for the CATENA project last year. But we have this problem: if the New Testament text in CATENA manuscripts is subordinate to the commentary, it illustrates the commentary rather than the commentary being an illustration of that. To what extent can we justify including CATENA manuscripts in editions of the New Testament? We also have this issue, which Grant Edwards, as far as I'm aware, first observed, but has been borne out by the initial analysis of our project, that most of the CATENA manuscripts selected for the ECM represent later textual developments in Byzantine tradition. The use of test passages to select manuscripts for the ECM which differ from the majority results in this large proportion of CATENA in the Pauline epistles. But their non-majority readings are secondary, they're post-majority readings or post-Byzantine majority readings, if you like, and they have little to contribute to the Ausgangs's text. However, fortunately, they do represent part of the textual history of the first millennium. So we're justified to have them in the ECM because they illustrate that. But at the same time, they may be disproportionately represented simply by virtue of differing from that majority text. And if we were to exclude all CATENAe, we risk running once again into these problems of definition. Not all manuscripts now classified as CATENAe were originally intended to contain exegetical material. Others have the wide margins typical of CATENAe, but they don't have any scholium. So were they originally intended to be CATENAe and the commentary was never added? And some biblical texts might have been copied separately from CATENAe. So we need to have them somewhere in our editions to work out how other manuscripts relate to them. I think defining a New Testament manuscript is notoriously difficult, but if we start trying to close these porous boundaries, then we lose the ability to make connections which might be relevant. So I hope that gives you a reasonable introduction to the project and sets the scene for the rest of the colloquium. You know where we're coming from. Do continue to visit the project website, where we will keep on adding details of open access publications in the coming months. And I'm hoping too that the presentations at the colloquia will also be sufficiently technically okay that we can upload them to YouTube and people can revisit those as well. So I'm going to close again at the minute with thanks to the European Research Council and the University of Birmingham, which has made it all possible, to the CATENA project team members, whom it's really been my privilege to call colleagues for the last 5 years, and have established a really solid foundation for ongoing work. And the next stage is both of CATENA research, but also of the ECM. And then third, to all presenters and participants for joining us and making this 13th colloquium possible, because I'm looking forward very much to what the next 3 days have to offer. Thank you. Had this been Wednesday, I'd say run off and get your sandwiches because you need to go to Hereford. But as it is, I think there are 4 minutes to take questions, Peter, if I'm allowed to have questions.
Who will be first? And you've got the online questions, right?
Okay, I'm just curious about these many commentary manuscripts. Do you see many corrections of the biblical text in the levels? Or are they kind of, does the commentary protect in a way? Because it's not the main thing you said in your reflections. I'm just curious.
Okay, so for people who are listening online and might not have heard you, the question is to what extent do we have corrections in the body of the lectionary text in commentaries, and what does that tell us about the relationship? The person who can answer that question better than me is sitting next to you, Tom. I mean, there are corrections to the biblical text of CATENA, but not, I think, a disproportionate number. And I'm also not aware of places where we can see the lemma text in CATENA being corrected according to the commentary or quotations in the commentary around, which I thought we would see a bit more of than we did. So I think, in essence, if it's not corrected because it's secondary, people are only using the New Testament text to work out where they are, to pin the scholia onto it. And they're not so worried about the form of the New Testament text at that point. That's my general impression. But thank you.
There is, of course, the exception of 424.
424 is exceptional in many ways. Yes. And that's the thing, there are some crazy CATENA manuscripts out there. I hope we're going to be introduced to some of them over the course of this week because they are very unusual. Were you going to talk about 424?
Well, all I would say is to echo that the CATENA doesn't seem to influence that commentary, the biblical text.
Yeah. Clark.
Having completed the project, I was just curious what you think, or what further research you think should or could still be done in New Testament CATENA going forward, if there's anybody looking to do more research.
Well, there's lots to do. I mean, hopefully, on the basis of what's presented now, you can see the state at which we've got to. We need an edition of Ephesians with a translation or other Pauline epistles. I mean, this is it. Kramer has been the standard for referring to CATENA since was it the 1840s or the 1860s when it came out? But he just chose two manuscripts, one in Paris and one in Oxford, and made his edition on the basis of that. Now, in some cases, he struck lucky, and he found a representative type of CATENA, which represents the majority. In the case of Paul, he didn't. He chose a single CATENA manuscript rather than the main Pseudoecuminum tradition, which I think is why the Pseudoecuminum tradition has been ignored over the course of the subsequent 150 years. So I think for understanding the Pauline CATENA, we really need those new editions. In terms of what other, well, yeah, I'm not going to answer that other question until we get to the end of the colloquium and see what other people's deflections are. But David Parker, in the colloquium that Garrick Allen hosted in Dublin about 4 or 5 years ago, said he thought looking at CATENA was an important next stage. And it's been really interesting to discover not only the sort of variety, but the limitations of CATENA as a tradition and how they are much more commentary-like than New Testament-like in some ways. And I think maybe that opens up more of a question as to whether there are other witnesses we ought to be considering as evidence for the text of the New Testament in the first millennium. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of information to get into, and I think that some of the tools that we've produced as part of this project, for the resources, particularly the catalogues, will help people do that. I think also the project's important to show that you can study CATENA and not go mad after 5 years. It's quite an important thing to know. Sorry.
Well, thank you to all the same contributors there. Thank you for your paper. It was so positive and affirming. But what I'm wondering is, do we know how these CATENA were used? Were they used by people writing homilies? Do we see phrases from the scholia taken over into homilies, or vice versa? I mean, why did they bother writing these apart from knowing you would work on one day?
Yes, keeping us busy. Well, I suppose to answer that, we actually need to go and start looking at homilies all over again, which I think people in Berlin are busy doing. So in that way, sort of pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are coming together. And at the minute, we don't know. I mean, we know that a compilation was made from existing homilies and commentaries, but the extent to which they were then used or plugged in to create sermons, create study within the lectionary corpus, and what extent we have lectionary indications in CATENA. I have seen a CATENA split up according to the liturgical calendar, suggesting that at least at some point connections will be made in that direction.
But just a quick, do you think they're then more in-house monastic text studied? Do we know where they're discovered as better?
I suspect they are, but I think we have Clark coming to tell us a little bit more on that later. So we'll wait to that now. But yes, I mean, that's interesting. What indication of use do we have, and the context for that is that other question to open up. So thank you. Okay, I think my time is over, and with any luck, you won't hear from me again for the next 3 days. I'll get Panayotis' presentation up and running.